benefits. So, in a lot of instances, as technology is brought to bear, there's people, whether it's early adopters or ones that can access that technology or have the capacity to use the technology, that tend to benefit more than others. And so, with different rates of expertise around sort of STEM subjects, not as many Māori involved in science and mathematics and some of the technology areas, that often means that their chances to benefit from these sorts of developments are less. So that was kind of the general, sort of the two main questions for our research program as a whole. But it's based around these three sort of particular areas. So one is Indigenous data and governance. And so there's a component of that, how do you think about the governance expectations of Indigenous data, with a particular focus on collective privacy. So we'll understand how privacy works and consent of individuals, of ensuring that their information is kept private. But how do you think about it if you're thinking about it at a community level? So what is the privacy considerations that might sit around the hapu or an iwi in terms of data that can be associated or related back to them? And then the sort of the flip side of that, in terms of thinking about that collective, that kind of collective responsibility, is how can value then be, if value is generated from that data, how is it then distributed back to that community? And what are the different mechanisms by which that might happen? So that's kind of the part of the focus around the first research aim. The second research aim is around Indigenous data and systems. And so that's one that is thinking more about, it's hard to do things with Indigenous data if you don't know where it is or you don't know what it is. And so unless you can kind of tag it in the systems, you're not in a position to work out what should happen. And so this focus on data classification and provenance, and then we have the sort of sideline component around whether or not you can value Māori data within systems too, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the third component is Indigenous data and artificial intelligence. So, as we're ending up with more and more data, and as we move to having more sort of computer-generated or machine learning approaches to how that data gets analysed, artificial intelligence approaches to analysing those things as well, what is the effect of that on kind of Indigenous worldviews? And so there's two components there. One that's really thinking about how you decolonize algorithms. So we often hear about algorithms that are creating inequities or embedding some of the inequities out of the training data that they've used, and that creates inequitable outcomes as well. So there's sort of one component that's facing that way, and then the other component is around indigenizing AI. And so how can you make use of sort of artificial intelligence tools to empower or reinforce or reimagine Indigenous worldviews? So those are how the research aims have been put together. Did I move? I did. Yeah. So we're not going to talk too much about the Indigenous data and governance part. That's led by Tukutuku, who had other commitments today. But at some point, their research aim will specifically talk about the things that they're working on. You can see here the people the teams that are involved in this work around Tikanga centered approach to Māori data governance frameworks. And I think they're doing some of that work specifically with hapu around how they would govern their set up frameworks to govern their data. And then this other component around mātauranga Māori informing new methods of benefit sharing for common pool data resources. And so Nick Jones has just started as a PhD student there and started thinking about the different ways in which groups come together, and that might become a place for common pool data resources. And in some places, that grouping will be on the basis of whakapapa. So whether that's, a hapu or an iwi, and whakapapa becomes the reason people are together, that might sit there. Other times it might be on the basis of where you live, kind of a kaingoan, so people all in this area and those things, and that might require a different sort of way of thinking about what appropriate benefit sharing looks like. So I think there was the sort of a whakapapa whānau, a kaupapa whānau. So we're all doing the same sort of things. We're all people that are in the sailing club. Actually, that's probably not a great idea, but maybe the Wakaama Club. So the Wakaama Club, all of them are hanging out together. There's some information which is all shared, which might be useful for something into the future. And how should that then be kind of shared back to them? And then the rohe, kind of the rohe-based whānau. So that's where some of the thinking around that component was heading. As I mentioned before, the component that I'm responsible for, we're thinking about how Māori data are organised within classification schema and how you maintain provenance data, or how do you maintain data provenance for that information, and the component that's really thinking about valuation of Māori data resources, but I'll talk to these things a little bit more in the future. But just to note that some of the work that we've done to date had been really about sort of scoping up the projects that we have for PhD students. So if people are got people around who they know are interested in doing PhDs or working on things in this sort of area, we've got these 3 projects associated with each of the kind of the 3 parts of this research aim. And you'll probably get a little bit better sense of what this is looking like as I give a description around how at least the first 2 of these 3 projects looks. And these are the teams that are working on the Indigenous data and AI. So Taka is responsible for this research aim. And he can talk a little bit more about how or the progress that's been made with these later on in the webinar. The only thing we just wanted to acknowledge was the recent passing of our colleague Paolo Mato. He was a member of our team, well, actually a colleague from before that, but a member of this research team, and unfortunately passed away earlier this year. So whakaro tūmana ki aia. And we also have a knowledge exchange steering group. So just really, this is a group who we convene on a sort of an annual or biannual basis just to talk about what sorts of activities are happening in the broader sector and where the ideas which we're working on here might find an avenue for expression, and we might be able to inform some of those areas. So these are, Te Puni Kōkiri, Social Wellbeing Agency, Stats NZ, BOMA, PwC, the Department of Internal Affairs, and then we've also got connections in with Te Mātauranga, the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and Maui Wingara, which is the counterpart in Australia as well. So I am going to give a bit of a sort of an outline of what we've been doing in the research aim 2, which is Indigenous data and systems. And it's primarily between work between here at the Institute and the University of Auckland School of Computer Science. And those has been working alongside Anahira Morihu and then Sebastian Link. And so this is work around the Māori subject headings framework, which is work that predates this project, but what it is it's fed into as we're trying to think about how these things get extended. So Anahira has been involved in this process since the start, working with the Māori librarian around how these subject headings are put together. And the challenge for them was around how they think about a cataloguing structure which is used in libraries to organise information, which was, very Western based around how information is organised, and how how you bring a Te Ao Māori paradigm to that as well, and what that might look like in terms of the sorts of terms you would then use to catalogue information. And so they, had to think both about what was, how they were positioning themselves in a Te Ao Māori paradigm and the sorts of ideas that would inform their thinking, and how that relates to the context in which it needed to be applied within the libraries, and thinking about, broader terms, main topic terms, related terms, how those link down into narrower terms. So this would be something that, if we think about indexes or contents, and helps us organize and find the things that we want to see. So they established the Tukutuku framework and used the whare as a way of connecting parts of the whare to those different terms. So you see there with the tahuhu talking about the broader term, how the kaho could relate to or be an analogy for the related term, and then the heke to the narrower term. And so it comes a way of linking these different components together, so that when you change it from the sort of the pictorial version back into one of these structures, you can see the kaupapa, which talks about what the word is, its whakamārama, and an English scope note, but that connects both upwards to the tahuhu in the broader terms, but also downwards through the heke to the narrower terms. And so this then becomes the structure for how they think about the relationships between a Māori word and other Māori words, or a sort of a context and other contexts. Now, one of the things which they had also done too is work with data scientists. So as they did this piece of work connecting all of the different Māori subject headings and laying those things all out, they then went here, and you can go to this. Actually, so this is where they collaborated with some data scientists in the US and created these network, or actually I think they're more than network diagrams of how the terms relate to each other. So each of those dots is a word, and they're connected in different ways depending on that structure of narrower terms and broader terms to all the other ones. You can probably make out, if you've got a really big screen or you've got really good eyes, the word on the left-hand side. Yeah, pūtaiao. And then the one on the right-hand side, yeah, tikanga tuku iho. But essentially, if you go onto the site and go across each of those dots, it will highlight what the word is. And then you can see how that word is then connected to all the range of other words. So, this is sort of the beginnings of then being in a position where you could start having kind of a machine learning approach to where the words are and sort of how they sit. So this is where they got to before our project started. And so we've been talking about how do we extend this. We wanted to see what a classification framework is, but they've done all that work in terms of content. So in terms of, content areas and what words get talked about in their relationships, that's all sitting there. And so it's how can we go further? And so this is where our connecting in with Sebastian is. So he's a professor in the computer science department, and been looking at the ways in which all these different sorts of elements are necessary to be in place if you want to be able to kind of head into an automated or a sort of a machine learning approach to how we sort of can deal with mātauranga within systems, or Māori words within systems as well. And so there's a number of these boxes in terms of the ontologies and the taxonomy, which Anahira has, and that team that she'd been working with, have already dealt with. And so we need to now just see if we can move deeper into the system so that it can start being applied in different places. And then this might have relevance in some of the areas where Te Taka works as well, or will be working in the future in terms of artificial intelligence. So there's that's sort of one component of our mahi, and it's been ticking along. And so we're really looking for the sort of this PhD student who can help us extend on the thinking that's gone on there. So we can think about that part of the system as dealing with the content part, the way content or mātauranga is organised within systems. And then the other part, which we thought was necessary to start thinking about, is what is the tikanga part that operates within systems? And so what are the rules and kind of protocols and how they apply? And so we know that within these sort of data infrastructures, that there's all sorts of Indigenous material that's sitting in them. That often it's often missing material about individuals' names or community names. So some of the provenance information is missing. That in most cases, almost all cases, the communities aren't the legal rights holders. So the copyright will be sitting with a researcher or an institution. And that as this material is being digitized into the future, or as it's being digitized, those mistakes that sit in the records are continuing forward into the digital life as well. And so this is not just a issue for the existing collections, but also for the new data that's being generated. So, researchers doing a lot of work. Those things have been taken forward, and that continues to perpetuate some of these problems. So my involvement in this area partly came about through thinking about issues around Indigenous data sovereignty, and this is all in some ways being prompted by these digitization efforts. And as that's happened, you've had this kind of shift of the way people can access it. So in the past, if you wanted to get knowledge and you had to go and talk to someone in person, they made an assessment about whether or not they would share it with you, and you could kind of control the spread of that information to a degree. As that information got written down, sat in a book, if that book was just in the library, there was a degree of control that sat around that. You had to go to the library to access it. As soon as that gets digitized, there's the physical barriers get removed, and then all of a sudden anywhere from around the world can start to access that information. So your ability to control that important data reduces. And so thinking about, how do you create more Indigenous control of Indigenous data in an environment that is making it easier for people to access is part of the challenge that we're dealing with. And so some of the things that have been informing thinking have been, at one level, it's been at the level of principles. And so we have things like the FAIR principles, and the FAIR principles inform the sharing of data. So how do systems get put together in ways that allows information to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? And these are the sorts of principles that are informing a lot of the open data movement and kind of data and increasing data sharing environments. And when some colleagues of ours that are a part of all the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Special Interest Group for the Research Data Alliance did an assessment of the principles that were emerging from Indigenous data sovereignty networks, they realized that while the FAIR principles focused on the characteristics of the data itself and made sure that the data was able to be shareable, the Indigenous principles were more about the people and the purpose. So what is the purpose of sharing and where is that going? And so we ended up with creating the care principles for Indigenous data governance. And so you see the thinking about collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, then become a complementary set to the FAIR principles. And both the RDA also supports the use of the FAIR principles and the care principles alongside each other. And this sort of shift into data governance came about in part because if the highest form of data sovereignty or Indigenous data sovereignty is being able to control it yourself and have possession of it. And in most instances, the data which we're wanting to deal with is sitting in other places. So it may be sitting in your institution, it may be sitting in other museums. And while it's in those places, the sovereignty conversation shifts to one around governance. So alongside that, there is, I think, an element which has sort of been hinted at previously is, where ownership is related to control. And so intellectual property, how those items in that digital space are owned, to how they might be controlled, how you might be able to express control over them, and what that looks like in terms of cultural authority. And so we have things like copyright and trademarks, which allow you to make use of the material yourself and limit the uses of other people. And as things have shifted into a sort of an open environment, there's a greater use of things like Creative Commons. But to be able to put in place a Creative Commons license, you first have to have claimed the copyright yourself. And then that's a licensing as a way of enabling that. So as an Indigenous community, if they're not the owner of it in a legal sense, they aren't in a position to put a license on it either. And so that's where this activity around putting labels on material sort of can sit alongside, it can sit as a way of providing an indicator of where the cultural authority sits, even if it's not sort of a legal authority. And so in thinking about how traditional knowledge labels can act as digital tags and systems, and so we talked before about one of the things you need to be able to do if you want to be in a position to kind of govern data is to know that actually where that data sits. In some places, that data might have iwi affiliation associated with it or an ethnic affiliation associated with it, which then can provide a grouping. In other cases where those things aren't there, how that gets reflected is sort of a harder proposition. But these the traditional knowledge labels are really digital tags that can sit in the metadata and start to give an indication of where the cultural authority sits, but also what the protocols look like. And just showing sort of an example, these are some of them. There's around 20 that have developed over the last 10 years with the developer, Professor Jane Anderson, who's also a part of our team, who's been working with communities to create protocols that reflect create labels that reflect the protocols that the communities have around sharing. And so in some places, those will be things like this may be restricted to men, or this might be restricted to women, or it might be a kind of a seasonal thing. So each of the labels has a human readable component. So the icon itself, and the icon remains stable. And you can see here why people use the labels. The attribution label is one that's applied in all cases because it's the one that connects that material back to the community and who should be being recognized as that's being made available for use in other places. But then you have ones here that kind of give a hint about what those protocols might look like. whether it's a seasonal one or a culturally sensitive material. And here's an example, and this is an example of how, while the icon remains stable, the text that sits behind it is customizable by the community. So we can have labels that can be recognized across multiple jurisdictions, whether that's different institutions or different countries, or different communities, but it can be localized to that community through the use of their own descriptions, but also through the use of their own language. And so here you can see how this attribution label has been renamed Squiksquats Tek Tamuk, which means name and place. And this is for the Scowlitz people, which is a tribe of the Stawell Nation. So this is up in British Columbia, and you can kind of see the picture there. And you can probably make out a little bit in the background that this label is sitting on a website, and the website is the Virtual Museum Canada. And so this is something where people can access, everyone can access, but they can see that this is the expectations of the community in relation to attribution. But there's also a few more labels in the background. One being it's for non-commercial purposes, future use is okay for outreach purposes, but not commercial purposes. And the tick means that it's been verified by the community as authentic. So knowing how easy it is for people to put information up, there's been a sort of a quality control element, which the community has been through as well. And so there are 20 traditional knowledge labels, and there are 10 bicultural labels. And the bicultural labels have been ones that have been put together to deal with genetic resources or data associated with genetic resources. But the labels themselves tend to fall in these three categories. So some of them do the job of identifying provenance and where the cultural authority sits. And that might be to a tribe, or it could be down to a hapu or a whānau, or it could recognize that there are multiple communities that have an association with that kind of data set. There are other labels that are more protocol-based ones, and so they tend to reflect traditional protocols. So they've been developed alongside communities as they're needed when the labels themselves are the existing ones that have meet their requirements. And then there are sort of labels that are a bit more oriented towards permissioning into the future, whether that's saying, the material is okay to be used for outreach, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, people are open to collaboration. Those labels are communicating that sort of expectation from the community. And so this is a kind of a poster which we put together through a project which we're doing to just start piloting the label with 3 different communities here in Aotearoa to make sure that that institutions can disclose the interests of the Indigenous interests that sit alongside material in their institutions, and that's by applying notices. And then that communities have the chance to add whatever appropriate labels sit in there, and that kind of reinforces their rights and their cultural authority in relation to that material. So that was the things that we're working on in essentially Research Aim 2 in the Tikanga Technology Project. And I will stop sharing and hand over to Te Taka.
Okay, kia ora mai mō tērā. Just so that everybody is aware of who I am, ko te Taka Keegan tōku ingoa, no konei ahau, no Waikato Maniokoto, he taha no ngō Ngāti Prau, he taha no Te Arawa no reira. Kei te mei atu ki ngā rangatiratanga I rungi a koutou katoa tēnā koutou. So I'm a associate professor in the computer science department here at Waikato University, and I've been here for a generation, shall we say, a long time. And most of the work that I've been doing over the last 20 plus years that I've been here has mostly been involved with Māori language and technology, Māori language interfaces. But I've come on board the TINT project to have a look at a couple of AI aspects. And I haven't got as many slides as Maui. In fact, I've got quite a few less. In fact, I haven't got any slides at all. But Maui, could you put up that slide that listed our projects, and we'll just look at that for a little moment. So the one that listed the RA3 sections, and I'll just have a quick talk about that, and then that'll be me. Yes. So if you could just full screen that.
Oh, is that not full screened? Is that not full screen?
No, we've got your next slide.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry, I have to try and. Let's go. Try that. Is that better?
Yep, that's it. Kia ora. So this is the component of the Tikanga and Technology project that I'm working on, and basically it's divided into two sections. And before I start talking about that, Mario already mentioned the line at the bottom there is a mihi to one of the researchers we had here, Dr. Paolo Mato, a really cool guy. It was a great loss when he died earlier in the year. Nō reire te rangatire Paolo moi wanginu a tātou katoa I konei tēnā koe. Okay, so the section that I'm working on has basically got these two sections here, RA 3.1 and RA 3.2. So I just want to have a quick talk about what those sections are. I haven't got any slides to show you because basically we're just in the early stages of figuring out what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, where we're going to do it on. So once we get a bit further down the track, perhaps we'll have another webinar and we'll go into some of these things in a little bit more detail. The first part of Research Aim 3 is looking at algorithms that have bias. So it's about decolonizing algorithms. So we've got a bunch of people working on the project there. So we've got Dan Wilson, he's at, I think, officially Computer Science Department at the University of Auckland. We've got Kiri West, who's working on her PhD. We've got Kylie Reidy, who's works for a research company in Wellington, who also brings a bunch of her researchers with her. We've got Paul Brown, who's a researcher here at Waikato University in the maths department, and has recently been awarded a Te Whitinga scholarship. So it means he gets to spend a couple of years just doing research on whatever he wants to. So this is where he'll be researching as well. And then we've also got Dion O'Neill, who's at the University of Auckland, but he hasn't really had much time to work with us lately because he's been doing a lot of the modelling work for COVID that the government is currently using. So that's kind of the team that we've got. And basically what the team is doing is looking at algorithms that produce bias in systems. So the different places that they're working in, they have access to different types of algorithms. So the first part of their work is just to decide which particular algorithms they want to look at. And then it's looking at those particular algorithms, looking at the data, determining where is the bias, where is colonization happening, and where can we stop it? How can we stop it? How can we readjust it? How can we realign the algorithms to account for the bias that, to be fair, most often is occurring because of the data. So it's really looking what the algorithm is doing, how it's being affected by the data, the biases they're producing, what are the harmful effects of the biases, how does it create the biases, how do we reconfigure, how do we decolonize that kind of thinking, and then improve our algorithms. One of the things, and it kind of wasn't something we originally thought of, but one of the things that the group has decided to do is to create an assessment set of guidelines, with the thinking that the common pitfalls that are being found, if we can make a checklist of things that people, if they're looking at bias in their algorithms, that they could check off with. So that's one of the things that they'll be developing on. The work is quite early in its stages at the moment. Maybe further down the track, we could do just a webinar on bias and algorithms and discuss a whole bunch of things. So that's for further down the road. And then the second section, rather than specifically looking at the algorithms within AI systems, we're kind of more looking at the AI systems more conceptually. And so the second part has got like these three main sections really. The first section is really looking at the whole concept of artificial intelligence and how does that clash with some of our tikanga, with some of our mātauranga, with some of our kaupapa. So we've got a PhD student there, Hudson, who's sitting down with kaumātua queer knowledge, Māori thought leaders, and just teasing out some of the questions. What are some of the Māori aspects around an artificial intelligence element or an artificial intelligence identity, and things like, does Māori exist within an artificial intelligence, and where is it created, and how is it protected, and what kind of things do we need to do as Māori to protect ourselves as Māori, our knowledge, other aspects like wairua, how can we protect those kind of traditional aspects within an artificial intelligence system. So there's a whole bunch of quite thought-provoking questions that are being asked, and I'm really interested to see what are some of the ideas that we're going to be generated from that. So that's the first part of the second section. The second part of the second section is we actually want to go and build an AI system, but we want to build it from a Māori perspective, from ground up, from a Māori perspective. And what we're thinking of, we still need to do a little bit more work on this, but what we're thinking of is what is an AI system that as Māori we could have control of and build and work to us. And the application we're looking at the moment is a natural language processing application, an NLP application. And we're looking at that application simply because, what is some data that we'll be able to use that as Māori we can control. It's our own data, we have our own ownership of it. And if we can look at some Māori language data, that's been recorded for specific purposes, and if we can get enough of it, then maybe we can build an AI system around it. And if we can build an AI system around it, then it's investigating all the steps that we need to create to build that AI system. So we're looking at gathering some data, Māori data, Māori language data initially, and then building a natural language processing AI system around that data, and then look at all of our processes. And then if we can build it, then we'd like to analyze it and again, create perhaps some guidelines on, if you are creating an AI system, how could you create an AI system that worked for Māori, that was responsible to Māori, that Māori could utilize in a Māori way. So there's a whole lot of questions in there that we want to look at. A whole bunch of those questions, I'm not sure how we can answer. I'm not sure if there even is an answer, but we want to have a good shake of it and see what comes out of it. Okay, Maui, so you can stop sharing that. Thank you. So that's kind of what we're looking at in the third section of Tikanga and technology. We've just, at the moment, got a kind of a general idea where we're going. Where we'll end up, I'm not quite sure. I'm more excited than I am afraid of where we'll end up. I think we should be able to come away with some quite thought-provoking areas. But anyway, that's what we're about. That's what our section's about. And because all my slides are over, I've got nothing left to talk about anymore. So, kia ora tātou.
Kia ora te Taka. Hey, there is a question in the chat, or a comment in the chat from Kingy Gilbert. Kingy, did you want to ask that, or you want me to ask it for you? About whitelists and blacklists and the framing of online. Kia ora, Kingy. Oh, we haven't got you though, you're muted.
It's Mike. Change your settings, cousin.
Sorry, not Mike.
So the mute button is off, but there's no sound.
Yeah.
Kia ora koutou.
Oh, there we go.
Been switching backgrounds, and I'm going to blur my shed. Kia ora whānau, ko kingi tōku ingoa, he uria hau no tainui te arawa, me tōku maru waka, tēnā koe Maui, tōku whanaunga. Lovely to hear you all. Just a bit of an explanation about that, I guess. I'm a coder and a developer, so I encounter this kind of framing frequently when we're working on either shuffling arrays, like a simple algorithm that is moving people in and out of viable sets. And it's basically this thing called a blacklist, which are these people don't go forward, and then the whitelist. And these are just some of the kupu that I see every day, I guess, working in development and programming that give me a lot of concern, I guess, for how, how are we reframing these? I think that's also a really important part of the question, and developing our own language and making sure that as we go into these places, we're almost not adopting some of these current set of framing. You know what I mean? Yeah. That was it, really. Apologies, it wasn't really a question. Just something I see it frequently. And first time I saw it, I was like, who made up this idea, you know? And just that was it, really. So sure you fellas have lots more questions.
So, Kenny, how could we reframe it? Could we have a third list? Could we have like a grey list or a brown list? How do you think we could reshape the system to work in a different way? Could we have a list that for one particular example it was one colour, but for a different example or a different application, it changed its colour, so it was like a changeable colour list? How do you think we could do that?
Maybe colours, we don't need colours, eh? Yeah, particularly with Black Lives Matter and all of that, you know, like we probably could, should we be using colours? Yeah. I haven't gone into the etymology of it, but I'm sure there's some background there as well. Yeah,
One of the fortunate things with Te Taka's team in this space is working with Kylie and Kylie Verdi. So they run Nicholson Consulting, which are actually developing operational algorithms for a number of government departments. So, and I think, you know, this sort of, you know, how you're framing it with kind of whitelist, blacklist, or, you know, who's in and who's out of any particular decision is also, and I think one of the problems is it's often based on the manual systems that are in place, and you're just trying to automate some of those existing processes. And so how do you step away from the process as it exists? Think about how it gets reframed, you know, as, you know, however that is as you're talking about it, and then I guess re-automate something, you know, something that represents a different process and hopefully a fair or more equitable one. I think that's a challenge, because there'll always be an in or an out. It's just who's in and who's out at any particular point in time, and what was the justification for those decisions.
It looks like Hugh had a comment on that, Hugh.
Oh, kia ora. I just off the top of my head thought that other terms could be, basic, sort of not based on, as Keegan was saying, not based on colours. Just why not just allow and disallow, and sort of really slim it down to basic terms that make sense.
Thanks, Hugh. Hey, Rebecca, you put your camera on. I think you must want to say something. How about you, Victoria?
Half of us are from Auckland Museum. You can tell that we're engaged in this process. I think we're feeling like there's a sense of we've opened up our collections, and it was at a time, maybe 5-6 years ago, and it was at a time where it was sort of just like everyone get their content out, and then we've gone, probably didn't think about the ramifications of what that means. And I think what I'm sort of interested in is how do we step that back or amend that to reflect our developing understanding of the space. So I think we're still really trying to understand what it means for a big institution with 6 million taonga, and how do you actually make sure that we're not perpetuating that sort of, because we're a colonial construct, how do we not do that for another 160 years?
Yeah, look, I think that's, and that's sort of like the situation we find ourselves in. I know even in some of the institutions which Jane have been working with, say like the Smithsonian, where they were putting out their they digitized all the photographs they had of Native American communities and sort of released those earlier this year, and copped a real backlash. And you've got these sort of competing, I don't want to call them competing interests, but this sort of push around digitization and making things open, which is all sort of about access and things, and at the same time trying to be more respectful of Indigenous rights and Indigenous culture, and they're not necessarily traveling on the same pathway. And I think probably at the moment it's still like it's pretty clear what the pathway looks like for the opening things up and what needs to happen for that to happen, but it's not exactly clear what all of the possibilities are around the kind of respect for Indigenous rights, and how that is best done. Is that the kind of the advisory governance groups, is that becoming more kind of co-governance, more participatory around the way that the governance of the institutions look? Is it sort of the different things with Indigenous curators starting to get involved in the way things are represented? I think it's probably all of those things and then some. And I think, even with the labels, it's a mechanism that will help, but it won't do everything. And I think that's probably sort of an important distinction, but it can help. And the other challenging thing around it is it's taken, 100 years to get your collection together or longer. And it's probably going to take a fair amount of time to be able to, sort of bring, to do the labour that helps to fix or correct some of those sort of mistakes that are sitting on there. I think if there's in the first instance, an openness to doing it and a sort of a commitment to doing it, and then a sort of a transparency about what's happening and what can happen. Because I think the other bit with communities too is that they can only engage when they actually have the sort of time and space and can prioritize that work on top of everything else. So I think it'll move forward in a sort of like a little bit of a patchwork in some respects. Te Taka, you got some comments?
So there's always going to be issues with technology as it clashes with tikanga. And I think it's because, tikanga were created without technology, so they haven't really been built and shaped around technology. So like, one of the classic examples is should we live stream our tangihanga? Because of, spiritually, what are you doing? But given that we're locked down and, family would like to go or like to be a part, one argument as well, if it allows families to grieve and it assists with healing, then, perhaps we should allow that. But then there's other thinking around, from a spiritual perspective, what are you doing? How are you engaging? So I don't think there's no one set answer. This is the way. When we had the lockdown last year, my mother died. My mother died in that lockdown. And we knew she was going to, she didn't die because of COVID, but we knew she was going to die. So I had a few weeks to kind of try and process what was happening and try and figure out, okay, well, we're in a lockdown one, we've got this particular situation, how can we adapt our tikanga to handle what's about to happen? And, that's obviously just got to learn to be flexible, be able to adapt, and then kind of make the best of it. And I think when we're dealing with technology and encroaching into new spaces or making new things available, that's, we have to be open. I think we have to be open to allowing technology to come into some of our spaces, and then, doing our best efforts, our most sincere efforts to keep it within our tikanga. And then when we break those tikanga and when we do wrong things, which happens, then we've got to realize, okay, well, this was wrong because of these reasons. So now I'm going to take the time to go and fix that up and maybe adjust some of the settings, maybe apply TK labels, maybe engage with the correct parties so that in the future this happens. But not everyone is like this, but I'm of the kind of thinking, let's just try it, figure out all the mistakes, and then let's build on the mistakes and go forward. But I know a lot of other people would feel too nervous about applying technology into different places. But I'm not that guy. Let's give it a shake and see what can happen and clean up after our mistakes when we've wrecked everything.
Learn, not clean up, learn.
Learn and build better systems because of it.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, everybody. Oh, sorry, Kingy, do you want a quick comment? I'm just a bit conscious we're coming close to the end of our time, but go for it.
Oh, thank you. I will lower my hand. Just wanted to say, yeah, I agree with you, Te Taka, on that one. One thing I was looking at was prior to technology, what other traditional systems moved from a traditional framework into a modern framework. So Roger Nisha's book on the Ngāti Tarawhai carving, he talks about how carving moved from an embodiment state of being tupuna being embodied in the carvings to then becoming, over 10 years, becoming more or less just a form, a piece of artwork. And how that, and so he detailed over 100 years, and this is his whakaaro, but I thought it resonated, how artists and artisans and knowledge holders shifted with the times. And now if we look at Māori artwork, it's everywhere. It's on a matariki campaign for a fertilizer manufacturer, and also on marae. And if we look at that as a study of translation of culture into a new media, perhaps we might follow those similar sort of evolution of tikanga. Evolution, the right word? But, the community approach to changing tikanga as the time permits. Yeah, and it does change. And I think, it's almost difficult to stop change. So how do you influence it in the way that you think is in line with your tikanga and your kawa? Yeah, that was my... Thank you for letting me have that little interlude, Natalie. Killed it.
No worries. Sorry that we're going to have to cut this short. This conversation was getting really interesting. But next month we have another webinar, which we will advertise out and let everybody know what the topic is. We're going to be having every quarter, we will have a shared webinar with Te Mātauranga about data sovereignty. So, Maui, do you want to finish for us?
Sure, kia ora. Yeah, look, just to say, amihi kia koutou, whai wāhi tano mai tēnei ahiahi. Thanks for joining us. It was great to see Kingi and everyone else coming to just kind of share thoughts. And I think as this develops, obviously we'll have other people get involved too. And I think this was actually a really good little reminder to us to leave more space for the conversation. So I better sort of follow Te Taka's guide for presentations and use less slides. And I think there'll be lots more time for kōrero. So just ngā mihi ka koutou tēnei ahiahi, whānau hei whakakapi ngā kōrero, kia tau ki tātou katoa, te atu whā tō tātou ariki raiti te ara o te atua me te whiwhinga teitanga ki te wairutapu ake ake āmene. Kia ora koutou.